Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul, and thanks also to Sepideh and Conrad also for organizing this dispersed get-together. So I'll just get straight into my talk without further ado. So the notes and reflections I'll present today aim to explore the conjunction between the conceptual and methodological optic of real abstraction and critical theories of fascism. While the most tenacious theorist of real abstraction, namely Alfred Sohn-Rethel, made important empirical and theoretical contributions to the study of the nexus between fascism and capitalism, collected in English in the volume Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism, and non-English editions, that is to say the German and Italian, of Intellectual and Manual Labor feature brief discussions of Nazi economy and ideology, I will argue that the theoretical development of the articulation between fascism and real abstraction is principally to be sought elsewhere, namely in the writings of Sohn-Rethel's only real philosophical interlocutor, Theodor Adorno, and in the largely neglected theory of fascist ideology sketched out by Norbert Guterman and Henri Lefebvre in their 1936 book, La Concious Mystifier, Mystified Consciousness. But before exploring these theoretical threads, I think it is worth recalling at some length the centrality of the phobia of abstraction in fascist and more specifically in Nazi ideology. In his book, The Law of Blood, Thinking and Acting as a Nazi, Johann Chapoutot has surveyed Nazi theories concerning the cumulative alienations and denaturings enacted by Christianity in the Nazi mindset, dubbed a Judeo-Asiatic theory of salvation, and the usurpation of the concrete and earthly bases of German right and justice by the so-called Judeo-Roman apparatus of abstract law. And after, we can of course hear the echo, of course, of the famous nexus of the Judeo-Bolshevik as well behind the Judeo-Asiatic and the Judeo-Roman. The alienation of the German folk was understood by National Socialist ideologues as a supplanting of the natural, rooted morality of right, expression of a vital and racial normativity, by a multitude of abstract laws. Summarizing the ideological Weltanschauung advanced by Nazi jurists and legal historians, Chapoutot writes that for them, I quote, Jews were beings of abstraction, for they hated what was real. This hatred had led them to invent artifice, to take refuge in what did not exist, in phantasmagoria confabulated in their poor, sick heads. It was the Jews who had written the laws. They were the people of the law because they were incapable of living and thinking the law, the natural law, that is, which was a pure expression of the natural world they were defying. Opening the 1936 Conference on Jewishness in the Science of Right, Carl Schmitt would crystallize this argument that the mixed ontology of the Jew, what he called the Jewish chaos, required a compensation at the juridical and epistemological level in what he called Jewish legality, thus marrying, I quote, a crudely materialist sensualism and the most abstract moralism. It is perhaps not irrelevant here to note how much these terms repeat Orientalist tropes of the Muslim as oscillating between the fanatical abstraction of desert monotheism and the lascivious abandonment of the harem. As Chapoutot summarizes this line in Speculative Racism, I quote, this formlessness had led the Jews to seek refuge in formalism. Since their ontology was labile and uncertain, they found reassurance and structure in and through the rigidity of unquestioned and imperative norms. The Jews were the people of the law, according to the Nazis, obviously, because they needed its normative backbone to live. This law did not lead them to construct a cosmos, however. Instead, it commanded them to act in keeping with its nature, which was to sow chaos and devastation. Formless, deformed, the Jew deformed and destroyed, unlike the Aryan, who informed and conformed. Seen in this light, the need to rid German legal life of all Jewish elements was understandable. The Jewish mind had to be hunted down and practitioners of Judaism mercilessly expelled. End of quote from Chapoutot. This formlessness begins with the imposition of what these Nazi jurists viewed as a Judaized Roman law, or rather this formless formalism begins with the imposition of what these Nazi jurists viewed as a Judaized Roman law. Summarizing a little earlier the principles of National Socialist legal thought in 1934, Schmitt again would articulate Nazism as a critique of separation. Its great deed being, I quote, the overcoming of the schism and shearing that stood in the service of certain political tendencies for many centuries. Against this entire system of antitheses, what he called the systematic shearings, body and soul, spirit and material, law and politics, law and economy, law and morality, what was needed was the recognition of the fact that, and here he was quoting some anonymous US legal scholar, we are today experiencing the bankruptcy of the idée générale. Now, the Nazi juridical movement was thus tasked with undoing what Schmitt called the monopoly of the juridical and tearing down what he termed this normativistic Tower of Babel and putting in its place a healthy, concrete order of thought. It is therefore necessary, according to this line of argument, to recognize the ongoing after effects of what Schmitt termed a certain legal historical event, namely the reception of Roman law, which, while beginning in the concrete forms of life of Roman peasants, paterfamilias, and soldiers, becomes, writes Schmitt, the most senseless, most scandalous, most dangerous thing in the world, once detached from a concrete reality, carried over to another order of a folk, once the abstraction of its detached maxims is passed off as the only pure juridical and scholarly wisdom. And crucial to this translatio and corruption is the mediation of what Schmitt terms the existentially normative Jewish people who, as perennial metics, require a calculably effective norm, a norm abstracted from the concrete. As Schmitt puts it pithily and xenophobically, quote, the foreigner wants to have a timetable to know where and when and where he can get off. This is a sentiment with which I largely agree, but the foreigner wants to have a timetable to know when and where he can get off. Obviously for Schmitt, this is an entirely negative thing. As a result, he puts in place of justice the law in the sense of the previously determined calculable norm. The struggle against Roman law, and this is not just in Schmitt, it seems to be a kind of leitmotif for this whole Nazi juridical as well as partly philosophical scene, and political anti-Semitism does turn out to have a more than elective affinity. With the rise of what he terms a concrete order of thought over against an abstract normativistic one, Schmitt and his fellow German Nazi jurists will have to choose. And Schmitt says, with a now very strange and uncanny metaphor, it will do these jurists no good to retreat onto the melting sheet of ice of the old forms of convulsive normativism and positivism. This modern march of formless formalism against racial concreteness is further exacerbated from the vantage of a Nazi critique of abstraction by the long arm of the French Revolution, understood as a kind of race war that hunted down aristocratic and a fortiori Aryan purity, replacing it with the amorphous, the undefined, the hybrid. Monetary and financial abstractions were themselves figured as allies of this long revolution of the formless, in arguments that of course have weirdly Burkean resonances, right? The link between money or paper money and revolution, if you recall Burke's text about the French Revolution. For the Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg, speaking during the occupation of Paris, the war against England was a war between blood and gold. The latter understood, quote, as a financial instrument, this as a quantitative democratic, this is Rosenberg, right? As a financial instrument, money, as a quantitative democratic universal equalizer that dissolved all hierarchies, especially those of race and blood. For the Nazi historian of the philosophy of right, Kurt Schilling, the mania for abstraction could be traced all the way back to the Stoics and then forward to Rousseau and the rise of the Enlightenment as a mathematical age, a mathematical democracy grounded on an abstraction hostile to life. That's a quote from Schilling. And again, there are very strange resonances of the place of the geometric and the mathematical as a quality of revolution in Burke's formative texts reacting against the French Revolution. Now, precisely this kind of phony war on abstraction is vivisected in the research project on anti-Semitism published in the final 1941 English language volume of the Institute for Social Research's journal, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, at the time also called Studies in Philosophy and Social Science, when the Frankfurt School was obviously in Morningside Heights at Columbia. The targeting in this volume, though mainly oblique or indirect, of Schmitt's juridical Judeophobia is no surprise, considering that Institute members like Kirchheimer and Neumann had been close to the author of the concept of the political. Instead of purely repudiating anti-Semitism as a manipulation or prejudice, the Institute sought to detail how certain materially reproduced Jewish social character traits identified, magnified, and distorted by the anti-Semite, and by the Nazis in particular, find, I quote, this is from this text in volume 9, issue 1 of the Zeitschrift, find their roots in the economic life of the Jew, in his particular function in society, and in the consequences of his economic activity. The first of these is that Jews do, according to this Institute text, the so-called dirty, if immaterial work of capital, namely as middlemen. As the research project drafted by Adorno observes, and I quote, "From olden times, the practice of extending credit has prevented the antagonism between the possessors of power and the economically oppressed population from leading to recurrent catastrophes." End of quote. But in crisis, the Jew becomes perceived as a factor of impoverishment. The increasing importance of intermediary functions to modern capital is in turn the basis for what they call the maneuver for distraction that consists in presenting an intrinsically Jewish, non-productive capital as the source of social ills. As evidence in this text, in Wagner's mythology, which, quote, contrasts the heroic productive Siegfried, a mixture of the munition manufacturer, the condottiere, and the rowdy, with the dwarf, a symbol of the owners, merchants, and the resentful, eternally complaining proletariat. End of quote. The Nazi struggle against Roman law, which they address specifically, and therefore, in a sense, addressing Schmidt's own comments specifically, is then traced back to the political economy of Jewish life under capitalism and its ideological effects. I quote, this is again from the research project. "Since its Roman origin, civil law has been the law of creditors, whereas it recognizes no difference between any groups or individuals, but aims at the universal protection of property, it is a priori antagonistic to the debtor. Historically," continues Adorno, putting together the thoughts of his fellow members of the Institute, "because of the creditor role of the Jews deriving from their functions as bankers and merchants, we find them usually on the side of rational law. Their foes, on the other hand, favor a vague natural law based on, quote, the sound instinct of the people." End of quote. This affiliation with juridical abstraction, grounded in the historical trend subtending the social positioning of certain strata of Jews within European societies, is then presented as the further basis for the association of Jews with abstract intellectual labor tout court. As an effort to ground the anti-Semitic fascist phobia for abstraction, of which I've just spoken, in the distorted refraction of certain real social processes, that is to say, in the history of European racial capitalism, this section of the research project is worth quoting at a little length. I quote, "The psychological faculty for abstraction developed with a commercial and financial function. In the commodity economy, men face each other as equals, not according to distinctions of birth or religion. It does not matter who they are, but only what commodity they want to buy or sell. The abstract notion of the thing as a commodity corresponds to the abstract notion of man. It makes no difference if one sells art, objects, cotton, or guns. The psychological functions which are developed on the basis of such economic conditions and the mentality which corresponds to them are of course not limited to the Jews. Calculating, so-called rationalistic thinking has been developed chiefly by non-Jewish philosophers. Anti-Semitism, however, seeks to identify the Jews with this school of thought. The study of the so-called Jewish mentality," Adorno continues, "explains why the Jews are blamed simultaneously for capitalistic and revolutionary, relativistic and dogmatic, tolerant and intolerant mindedness. Such contradictory accusations do not in fact reflect upon the Jews, but rather upon the state of mankind in the present historical period. The Jews are but the bearers of society's inconsistencies." End of quote from Adorno. In moving to the place of anti-Semitism within Nazi ideology itself, the research project seeks to ground the very possibility of Nazi policies against the Jews in the shift out of a market economy, the delinking of German capitalism from the anonymous, abstract, and impersonal compulsions of price. The link between the commodity abstraction and the political and juridical, even the democratic abstraction of the citizen or person, is at times advanced as though the authors remained on the hither side of Marx's own articulation of this relationship in texts like On the Jewish Question. For instance, when Adorno, in his later remarks on the authoritarian personality, speaks, I quote, of the decay of individuality brought about by the decline of free competition and market economy. But this nexus between the historically different modalities, we could say the form determinations of capitalist abstraction and the political level, remain very significant, I think, for thinking how real abstraction, which again is also the abstraction of state and citizen here, can be articulated with the emergence of fascism as the false resolution and catastrophic acceleration of capitalist contradictions. Here, there's a very significant section of the research project called The Changing Function of Money, from which I'd like to quote. Adorno writes, again, anonymously, this is a text just signed by the Institute. In a laissez-faire economy, the entrepreneur could tell by the increase or decrease of the money capital which he invested in an undertaking the extent to which it was useful to society. Its collapse of that undertaking was a judgment of the market as to its social usefulness, and this judgment was proclaimed in money. In the totalitarian state, the free market is abolished and the ability of money to declare ceases to exist. The market, an anonymous and democratic tribunal, so it's interesting, also writing in 1941 in the US that this link, right, would be made. We can maybe discuss what that might entail also about the limitations of this perspective. But the market, an anonymous and democratic tribunal, they write, is replaced by the command and plan of those in power. In liberalism, as already mentioned, the unfit are eliminated by the effectiveness of the mechanism of competition, no matter what their names are or what personal qualities they have. In the totalitarian system, however, individuals or entire social groups can be sent to the gallows at any moment for political or other reasons. The replacement of the market by a planned economy of the state bureaucracy and the decline of the power of money capital makes possible the policy against the Jews in the Third Reich. This is Adorno writing in 1941. So what of the relation between abstraction and the potential for, rather than the actuality or reality of fascism? This question was, of course, addressed in Adorno's subsequent writings, namely his qualitative analyses from the authoritarian personality, where the problem, of course, was the fascist potential within the United States after the end of World War II and the defeat of Nazism. And this is specifically in a section called Ticket Thinking and Personalization in Politics. Here, Adorno is seeking to excavate the threads linking ignorance and confusion in political matters to the objective social grounds for a psychological or a socio-psychological disposition towards fascism. The problem, in a sense, is very much of the kind that would later be christened cognitive mapping by Frederick Jameson, namely that of the impossibility of generating a situational representation of one's relationships to a capitalist totality. Fascism is here framed by Adorno in terms of the individual scalar, epistemological, and material alienation from the dynamics and levers of capitalist power. Adorno places the emergence of what he calls certain techniques of orientation to cope with the paralyzing anxieties generated by the abstract opacity of modern capitalism, the imperative, in a sense, to generate what he calls substitutes for knowledge. These cognitive surrogates take two polar but specular forms. A misplaced abstractness that goes by the name of stereotypy, which Adorno says is both a tool and a scar in a very nice formulation, and a misplaced concreteness in the guise of personalization. Underlying these techniques is the objective social drift towards an integral standardization or reification of social life, the same kind that underlines Adorno's concurrent studies in the 1930s and 40s of commodity listening and what he calls plugging in popular music, and his polemics against the false freedom that defines what he calls the jazz subject. It is a largely achieved tendency towards integral reification that makes a method of the authoritarian personality possible, since the social and psychological ultimately collapse into one another with the obsolescence of the bourgeois individual and bourgeois autonomy, the end of experience properly so called. This is the situation in which, Adorno writes, the more stereotyped life itself becomes, the more the stereopath, it's a curious figure that he borrows from another writer whose name I can't now recall, not the sociopath, but the stereopath, feels in the right, sees his frame of thinking vindicated by reality. But stereotypy and stereopathy, in mimicking the very coldness and alienness of political reality that triggered anxiety in the first place, direct the subject towards a kind of ersatz concreteness, towards personalization defined as, I quote, the tendency to describe objective social and economic processes, political programs, internal and external tendencies in terms of some person identified with the case in question, rather than taking the trouble to perform the impersonal intellectual operations required by the abstractness of the social processes themselves. So the inability to cognize the dynamic of real abstraction then issues into these forms of personification. And here is where you have a kind of direct nod, right, to Sohn-Rethel's thesis, which were obviously very influential on Adorno within the text of The Authoritarian Personality, when he writes, stereotypy misses reality insofar as it dodges the concrete and contents itself with preconceived, rigid, and overgeneralized ideas to which the individual attributes a kind of magical omnipotence. Conversely, personalization dodges the real abstractness, that is to say, the reification of social reality, which is determined by property relations and in which the human beings themselves are, as it were, mere appendages. Stereotypy and personalization are two divergent parts of what I think is a nice formulation here, an actually non-experienced world. So that's what stereotypy and personalization converge on. Now, parenthetically, it is curious that Adorno treats these poles, stereotypy and personalization, as irreconcilable, since racist ideology in general, and anti-Semitism in particular, can be very much understood as a kind of stigmatizing personalization of abstraction, right? Even in Adorno's own, or Adorno and Horkheimer's discussions of anti-Semitism. It is particularly worthy of note, I think, that the period in which Adorno's engagement with Sohn-Rethel's ideas, as we can see in their correspondence, was most intense, was the same as that of his own study of Husserl, study called Against Epistemology, which was originally drafted when Adorno was in England, at Oxford in particular, between 1934 and 1937, and published later in the 1950s. And it's also the period of his writings on the fetish character of music and jazz. In the Husserl book, Adorno drew on Sohn-Rethel's insight to formulate his argument about what he called the reification of logic as the self-alienation of thought. For Adorno, the neglect of the changing content of the objects of thought is the abstraction that serves as a presupposition of all logic, including, of course, the logic to which Husserl was trying to give phenomenological grounding. This is what he writes in Against Epistemology, again, thoughts forged in the 1930s, but published in the 1950s. Logic, says Adorno, takes its cues from the form of commodities whose identity consists in the equivalence of exchange values. By the same token, however, it also looks to a societal relation unperceptive about itself, false consciousness, the subject. Logical absolutism is two things. It is reflection in the subject of a reification, which is performed by the subject, which itself ultimately becomes a thing. So the subject is, in a sense, reified by a process that finds its genesis in the subject itself. It's a kind of loop that takes place in this form of logical reification. It is also, Adorno continues, the attempt to break the spell of universal subjectivization and intercept, by means of something straightforwardly irreducible, a subject which, for all its power, suspects itself of arbitrariness, if not impotence. So in that sense, logic is also, the struggle of the subject against itself. And this is very clear in the next phrase by Adorno when he says, the most radical subjectivism becomes a phantasm of its own overcoming. This is what he sees as the kind of kernel, social and conscious, shall we say, of logic. To this thought, Adorno continues, truth appears as what remains left after one deducts its production costs, the wages of labor, as it were. In short, what in the vulgar language of science, enslaved to positivism, is ultimately called subjective factors. End of quote. Now, it is interesting to note here that for Adorno, while taking from Sohn-Rethel the notion of a projection of the commodity form onto the form of philosophical thought, Adorno is nevertheless, in a sense, always concerned with the moment of the subject's labor and with reification as a kind of subjective labor. In his lectures on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, published relatively recently in English, he will contend that in Kantian philosophy, as he puts it, the world, reality as a whole, is turned into a product, in fact, the product of labor, of effort, revealing what he calls the essential antinomy of bourgeois society in general, in terms of the twinned acceleration of subjectivism and reification. As Adorno observes, I quote, because analysis, this is in Kant, obviously, in the Critique of Pure Reason, because analysis shifts the entire weight of the dynamic character of reality onto the side of the subject, our world becomes increasingly the product of labor. We might say, and this is obviously not just a nod, it's a quote from Marx, right? We might say the world becomes congealed labor. So the Kantian concept of the world is a world as congealed labor for Adorno. And he continues, the livelier the subject becomes, the deader the world becomes. We might talk here of the commodity character of the world, whose rigidity and inflexibility keeps increasing thanks to this process. Thus, we have two concepts, Adorno says, namely subjectivization, the dissolving of the world into the activity of the subject on the one hand, and reification, the objectification of the world as something contrasted with the subject on the other. These two concepts, subjectivation and reification, have grown in magnitude and have become quite unstoppable, he says. Now, the matrix, end of quote, the matrix for this commodity analysis of Kantian philosophy bears strong analogies, I think, with those remarks on stereotypy and personification I just mentioned from the authoritarian personality. It also resonates, and here again we can see another presence of his discussions with Sohn-Rethel and of the whole problematic of real abstraction. It also resonates with the way in which the Marxian theory of commodity fetishism is refunctioned by Adorno to grasp the fetish character of contemporary music and the regression of listening in his famous 1938 essay, where he writes, I quote, "The more inexorably the principle of exchange value destroys use values for human beings, the more deeply does exchange value disguise itself as the object of enjoyment. It has been asked what the cement is which still holds the world of commodities together. The answer is the transfer of the use value of consumption goods to their exchange value, which contributes to a general order in which eventually every pleasure which emancipates itself from exchange value takes on subversive features. The appearance of exchange value in commodities has taken on a specific cohesive function, in the sense that people, of course, enjoy the very fact of consumption as consumption, and it's a logic, of course, we'll find in other formulations, much later formulations, not least very similar lines in, you could say, in Debord's Society of the Spectacle. Now, in this period of correspondence between Sohn-Rethel and Adorno, Sohn-Rethel's comments on Adorno's philosophical and musical work are also germane, I think, to our debate. And though I'm not really focusing on Sohn-Rethel here via Adorno, I do want to touch on some interesting moments of their dialogue. So in a letter from the 8th of July, 1938, Sohn-Rethel registers his dissent from Adorno's conviction that the liquidation of philosophical idealism must take place through immanent critique. That immanent critique, whose famous Hegelian principle quoted by Adorno is genuine refutation, this is Hegel, genuine refutation must penetrate the power of the opponent and meet him on the ground of his strength. The case is not won by attacking him somewhere else and defeating him where he is not, which I think is a good principle in general, as an aside. Against this, though, Sohn-Rethel posits that, as he puts it, only the critique of the genesis of a mental point of view, so the critique that he will think of himself as achieving later on with the full formulation of his position in Intellectual Manual Labor, only this critique of the genesis of a mental point of view constitutes a path to judge the immanence of that viewpoint and of its conceptual system. And he sees this as the point of his own reduction of the transcendental subject to money. Note, not the reduction of the transcendental subject to labor, which is in a sense what Adorno does in his comments on Kant, even though they circuit through the question of the commodity form of subjectivity and reification. For Sohn-Rethel, though, the forms of thought must be sought in commodity exchange alone, right, or in the commodity form alone. While it is the exploitation and labor, and he says this very specifically in their correspondence, which is in that sense enlightening, to exploitation and labor matter not in identifying what the forms of thought are, they matter in order to explain, as he puts it, how philosophy generates the fetishism of these forms and determines their material content. So it's at a further level of, or at a lower level of abstraction, shall we say, the labor and exploitation enter into any kind of critique of epistemology. Or, as he argues in a later letter to Adorno from the 22nd of April, 1942, where he's criticizing Marcuse's Reason and the Revolution, Sohn-Rethel says, "To my mind, the crucial point is this. The fetish concept of logic has a different social referent with respect to the fetish concept of value," right? So that these are not the same, right? They're not even isomorphic. The latter, value, refers to the antagonism between capital and labor. The first, that is to say, logic, to the antithesis between intellectual and manual labor. the determination of the socially necessary form of intellectual labor takes on its epistemological fetish character as logic through its combination with an eternal idea of truth, end of quote. Sohn-Rethel's comments on Adorno's philosophy and sociology of music, on the other hand, relate specifically to a memorandum called Questions and Theses, which is not published but is discussed in some of the literature on the Frankfurt Institute in exile, that Adorno had addressed to Paul Lazarsfeld, the director of the Princeton Radio Research Project that would eventually hire Adorno, allow him to leave England for the United States and settle there for the duration of the war. It's in a sense the memorandum is, Adorno's way of presenting himself and his perspective on this project to Lazarsfeld. It is striking here that in this letter, Sohn-Rethel, responding to Adorno's analyses, linked the reification of listening, the turning of the technology of listening and recording into what he, Sohn-Rethel, called a social concrete ear, a technical social organ of hearing, to his own ongoing analysis of fascism. He writes of the individual, this is Sohn-Rethel, individual expropriation of ears which has taken place with the radio, their formal socialization and nationalization. It's a kind of very curious kind of corollary to his analysis of fascism. Sohn-Rethel writes to Adorno on the 29th of January 1938 of how, I quote, in capitalism, and even more so in the fascist monopolization of the hearing of society, so the fascist monopolization of the hearing of society, individual consumeristic re-listening is reduced to the level of rubbish. End of quote. While not developing it in explicit relation to his arguments about real abstraction, this identification of the technical mediation of listening as a site for analyzing a nexus of capitalism and fascism is suggestive. Not least, I think, in its convergence with Adorno's repeated efforts during this period to develop his analyses of potentially fascist subjectivities through music, right? And through formal analyses of music. Here, Sohn-Rethel links the question of the technological reproduction of art to a technical and social expropriation of our sensory organs, and this in turn to his own definition of fascism as a kind of productive consumption or destruction of the consumer. A problematic but kind of fascinating reading of fascism that Sohn-Rethel also develops in the text then collected in Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism. And this is what he says about fascism actually in this letter to Adorno from 38. That fascism is an absolute conjuncture of investment, namely one that is emancipated from every final aim of consumption. A real war economy, you could say, right? The fascist conjuncture functions only because and until it offers products that do not go on the market, right? Products, of course, especially in the form of armaments. It'd be kind of interesting to read this in terms of more recent debates like Adam Tooze's book, The Wages of Destruction, on which we had a symposium in HM a few years ago, and other such works. Capitalism, continues Sohn-Rethel, writing to Adorno, no longer knows what to do with consumption. And because the latter is lethal to it, it must kill consumers in order to be able to continue to produce. But for capitalism, this need economically to eliminate consumption is due to the degree reached today by the socialization of the productive forces, a degree that is no longer digestible by capitalism. Socialized productive forces become autonomous with regard to the originary market laws of capitalism and force it to war production. End of quote. Now, a striking corollary of this bold, if in my mind quite problematic thesis, is that the ground for the formal genesis of the thought form, the matrix of real abstraction, namely commodity exchange in the market, is tendentially abolished by fascism, right? That seems at least part of this thesis. Against this argument, as well as against Adorno and Horkheimer's rushed and eventually nostalgic identification of individualism and market exchange contra-fascism, we could recall Marcuse's, to my mind, much more dialectical observation in his 1941 essay, State and Individual Under National Socialism, according to which, says Marcuse, the emergence of the Third Reich is the emergence of the most efficient and ruthless competitor. The National Socialist state is not the reversal, but the consummation of competitive individualism. This, of course, making Marcuse much closer to the theses of Neumann than those of Pollock in the debate about fascism that occupied the Frankfurt School. When Adorno tried to expand upon the perspectives on fascist potentials after his return to Frankfurt and the so-called group experiment carried out with Pollock and others on German perceptions of war guilt in the 1950s, the notion of real abstraction emerged again as a kind of explanans for fascism's afterlives. In a famous conference, first delivered in 1959, think, one of Adorno's most significant post-war political interventions, called The Meaning of Working Through the Past. This comes to the fore. Crucially for Adorno, the insistence of fascist tendencies mediated by forgetting was not a matter of German psychopathology, of some special path, but of a particular capitalist social structure and social unconscious. The atrophy of historical consciousness that made the living on of Hitler impossible, he declared, I quote, is necessarily connected. So this is the afterlife of fascism in putatively democratic capitalism, is necessarily connected to the advancement of the bourgeois principle. Bourgeois society is universally situated under the law of exchange, of the like for like of accounts that match and that leave no remainder. In its very essence, exchange is something timeless. And you can remember many sentences in Sohn-Rethel that play on this, right? The commodity at a standstill, right? In its very essence, exchange is something timeless, like ratio or reason itself, like the operations of mathematics according to their pure form. They remove the aspect of time. The persistence of fascism within the democracy is thus conditioned by capitalism's real abstractions as mediated, in a sense, by social psychology. Finally, to end this part on Adorno, move on to Lefebvre and Guterman for the final section. Contrary to the perception of a waning reference to Marxism in Adorno's conception of fascism and anti-Semitism, when he returned quite late to these questions shortly before his death in a 1967 conference on the new right-wing extremism, a conference that was published and translated recently, Adorno discerned the causes for the continued existence of the social conditions for fascism, which he saw in the late 1960s, in the ever-dominant tendency towards the concentration of capital and the consequent ways of déclassement and precariousness that saw large swathes of the population experience a vacillation of privileges whose libidinal correlate is not just a feeling of, Adorno says, but a desire for social catastrophe. It's a very kind of interesting analysis of the sort of political economic basis of the sort of nihilism, right, of a certain far right. And Adorno kind of notes, right, like what else would you desire if you have no social prospects, but also fear actual social transformation, right? And that's the kind of predicament of so many social layers in late capitalism, at least in his view. Now, as I've tried to show, the traces of the problematic articulated by Sohn-Rethel from the late 1920s onwards can be discerned in Adorno's own efforts to theorize both the actuality of and the potentials for fascism. In the same period in which these ideas germinated, that is to say the 1930s, a hitherto, at least largely overlooked elaboration of a Marxist theory of the reality of abstraction developed out of a militant and theoretical commitment to anti-fascism, namely in Norbert Guterman and Henri Lefebvre's 1936 book, La Conscience Mystifiée, Mystified Consciousness. Guterman, as I've tried briefly to detail in my introduction to the Prophets of Deceit, the book he would then publish with Leo Lowenthal, was himself on the margins of the Institute, and Lefebvre penned a review for their Zeitschrift. Whether and how either Guterman or Lefebvre or both would have come across the ideas of Sohn-Rethel, I think is a matter for some future detective work. Guterman and Lefebvre's project, of which Mystified Consciousness was to be but a first installment, the later ones, as usual, never turned up, was that of forging what they called a science of ideologies in this conjuncture of rising European fascisms, and significantly of the theoretically and politically disoriented communist and socialist resistance to those fascisms. The theoretical as well as strategic immaturity of the workers' movement and of communist parties, including the ones in which, or on the margins of which, Lefebvre and Guterman themselves were militants. Guterman and Lefebvre contended in this book that a materialist and proletarian destruction of capitalist fetishism must start with the embodied suspicion that one is, quote, being dispossessed of one's living existence by abstractions and survivals, end of quote. This last formula, abstractions and survivals, points both to the operation of the real abstraction that fascism cynically feeds upon and to the fact that the materiality of ideology is constituted by an often disorderly accumulation and historical sedimentation of seemingly obsolescent forms, beliefs, and practices. A theme that here chimes with Ernst Bloch's contemporaneous soundings of the dialectic of the non-contemporaneous or non-synchronous in his Heritage of Our Times. It is in the context of demolishing the mystifications of contemporary spiritualism as a philosophical and political and ideological trend that Guterman and Lefebvre employ the terminology, the very expression, real abstraction. So they write, the currently declaimed primacy of the spirit means merely the submission to capitalism's myths and its strange real abstractions. This is direct complicity with a vast lie which results in fascism. As in Sohn-Rethel's grounding intuition, these real abstractions are to be chased down and back to the simple spatio-temporal praxis that gives rise to them. The Guterman and Lefebvre's formulation, as bespeaks there, certainly Lefebvre's sort of surrealist dabblings or associations, is more poetic than analytical. The resonances are there. They write, the bloody themes are born right under our eyes, in our mouth, in our hands. We must resist the vertigo. The cycle of mystifications is complete, but it is born always and forever from these simple gestures: selling, buying, counting money, reading, thinking. The reading is a little interesting, it's not quite clear what its relationship to the selling, buying, or counting money, but we can talk about that. Now, according to La Concious Mystifier, we find in human beings what they call a prodigious heaping up of abstractions, notions, myths. In effect, they continue, our current consciousness is made up of all the experiences and all the interpretations that have appeared in human history, piled up and tangled without order. Everything can be found here, and not as moments in a totality, but as isolated elements in conflict with the rest of our consciousness. All the successive formations persist within us without being overcome in a chaos. Spirit, they write, is the false, superficial, abstract reconciliation of this incoherent heterogeneity. The modern metaphysics of spirit, they write, only expresses the mystery of capital, the only foundation of all the mysteries of this society. End of quote. And fascism, one might add more explicitly, is the reactionary use of sediments of these survivals in a social atmosphere of capitalist crisis structured by real abstraction and its shearing contradictions. We may also note here that the survivals of which mystified consciousness speaks consist of earlier layers of abstraction in a kind of geology of false consciousness. Anticipating Adorno's later understanding of the potentially fascist nature of coping mechanisms and orienting instruments under capitalist conditions, fascism, as understood by Guterman and Lefebvre, proposes a kind of fixity or rigidity to quieten the anxiety of those living the mental vertigo that arises from the destructive, decadent encounter between what they call accumulated abstractions, so these massive ideologies in heterogeneous disorder, and abstract financial capital, again, their formulation, in a phase when all social and political confidence has collapsed. Accordingly, a critical, which is to say a destructive analysis of fascism, can't rest content with tackling reification. It must take aim at the mobile and morbid nexus between the accumulated abstraction that is spirit, this parasite of flesh and action, which brings together all of the sediments and survivals from the historical and ideological past, and the contemporary abstraction of parasitic financial capitalism, with its train of inflation, speculation, advertising, and confidence or trust. Writing in the wake of the Great Crash, social abstraction appears as a kind of unstable, unreal reality, is their terminology. But this abstraction is also real, of course, in the sense of materially embedded. Financial capital, they write, never manages, I quote, to become independent and to separate itself from the capitalist and from production. Abstraction, yes, but one which presupposes an immense material system and apparatus, an abstraction that cannot displace itself above and beyond the rest of the world, opposed as concrete, but which intervenes and modifies and concretizes itself in acts. Social relations have been seized by this strange mythology of capital. Capital sweeps men away in this frightening machinery. It is a phantom with limbs of steel. And precisely linking the phantom to the limbs is also, of course, a critique of fascism, whose separation of productive and non-productive capital, of course, is ideologically constitutive. Particularly striking here, given the affinities between the debates on real abstraction and the post-structuralist fascination with the isomorphies between monetary and signifying economies, thinking of the works of people like Marc Schell or Jean-Joseph Gou, is the way Guterman and Lefebvre approach the problem of financial capitalism and its violence. They ask, what then is finance capital, this master more absolute than ancient despots which appears as a supreme reality? Their answer, it is nothing. This is a kind of remarkable answer in 1936, right? It is nothing but a network of abstract signs of writing games, but an entire economic and social machine, a whole enormous apparatus of violence sustain this abstraction. It is thus at once abstract and terribly concrete. End of quote. Marx's own insights into how money becomes the only real community from the Grundrisse are also echoed when they write that social power is anonymous, abstract, faceless, because it is the power of money. As with Adorno and the authoritarian personality, the explanation of the apotropaic attraction of fascist ideology centers on how the psychological burden of systemic opacity is displaced, plugged up by this fascist solution, at a time when they say social life has never been so obscure. So once again, this kind of problem of cognitive mapping and anxiety as a social anxiety as a clue to fascism. As they note, I quote, "This world is strange indeed, brutal, implacable by its system and its violence, and yet ungraspable, fleeting, abstract. One feels around oneself brute forces, destinies of a crushing rigidity, and yet the impression of unreality dominates everything. Where are beings? Who are they? What enormous human unreality around and within us, because there is no longer anything but an inexpressible dust of humanity fallen and scattered into multiple and multiform contradictions. Unhappy consciousness is torn above all by this contradiction, the flight of the real amid the rage to seize it, to possess it. The critique of everyday life, for which Lefebvre would come to be known in the post-war period, finds its wellsprings, I think, is evident in this book, in the critique of real abstraction demanded by the surge of fascism. The ideological fight against fascism cannot be simply, and perhaps not even primarily, a fight against fascist ideology or fascist ideas themselves. This is because, as they say, mystification cannot be the work of ideologues. They embroider on themes born in everyday life. And I think that's a very important formulation. The original mystification, and here again is where I see a kind of resonance of sorts with Sohn-Rethel. The original mystification takes place in the act of exchange, which is neither barter, speculation, or ritual, but, as they write, the constitution of new social relations, the entry onto the stage of a complex social process. By doubling, alienating itself in exchange value, the object becomes a quantitative fragment of an abstraction, homogeneous labor, social average labor. There operates through the fact of exchange, and once this fact is sufficiently generalized and regularized for there to be a market, a general average, a confrontation between all labors that neutralizes them into an abstract, quantitative, homogeneous substance, the only way of making commensurable and comparable qualitative labels. And while Guterman and Lefebvre do not engage in the kind of formal genesis stipulated by Sohn-Rethel, it is striking that they contend that any science of ideology must begin by attending to a pre-capitalist act of commodity exchange. Further, as with Sohn-Rethel's concurrent critique of epistemology, the science of ideologies is also an indictment of philosophy as practiced in their time, especially of a metaphysics which, in hypostasizing as spirit or being the impersonality of capital, and thereby occluding the possibility of capital's revolutionary destruction, makes its own contribution to the fascist situation. As they write, by impersonating alienation, I like that, sorry, by impersonalizing alienation, I guess they also impersonate alienation, but by impersonalizing alienation, metaphysicians make it conform more closely to the commodity fetish, more commercial and more manipulable, more acceptable and less painful. End of quote. The dual analysis in terms of abstraction and survivals comes to invest philosophy itself, delectably depicted as akin to one of those billionaires' castles built from fragments of cathedrals in their kind of striking image. By refusing to subject to practical critique, its anachronistic amalgams, spiritualist or metaphysical philosophy, stands in the way of a revolution which, understood as a realization of spirit, involves, in their words, the deployment and ordering of the geologically displaced and piled up strata of capitalist society. So it's a kind of, capitalist society is understood as this kind of permanent ideological wreckage, right? Which engages in, reproduces itself through endless acts of amalgam and salvage and remixing and synthesis, but which is not a totality in the dialectical sense, I suppose. This, as in Bloch, means that no nostalgia for bourgeois reason is possible, for, they write, this abstraction, bourgeois rationality, was already a ruse, a fog in which the germ of the new world wrapped itself up to protect itself. Later, the bourgeoisie would use the same weapon, abstraction, against the new class rising in its turn, the proletariat. To conclude then, unlike in Sohn-Rethel's materialist identity between the commodity form and the thought form, what Guterman and Lefebvre are after in seeking a science of ideology capable of confronting fascism's ideological work, which is to say its marshalling of libidinal and utopian energies from multiple pasts and uneven temporalities, is a way of thinking together the real abstractions and the accumulated survivals, money and myth, which of course also means money as myth. In other words, and by contrast with a rather linear tale of reification and standardization shared by Adorno and Sohn-Rethel to some extent, La Concious Mystifier articulates a critical stance sensitive to the embodied and embedded role of history and temporality in all their unevenness within contemporary ideology. An insight present not just in Bloch, but for instance, in a different vein in Gramsci as well, especially in his explorations of what he called folklore and common sense. In other words, from this standpoint, there is no logic or apparatus of abstraction smoothly running across multiple scales and sectors of capitalist society, and anti-fascist theory, qua critique of real abstraction, cannot operate at the level of the commodity form alone. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alberto. We have time for questions. Okay, I think people are just digesting you. Charlotte.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing, by the way. So I have a question into your discussion of stereopathy and personalization, and your discussion, which you credit to Adorno, of misplaced concreteness. And my question is coming out of a long-standing conversation with one of your colleagues at Simon Fraser, actually. I wonder, to sort of take this out of the politics of the 1930s and Weimar and the rise of fascism in a historical context, and to bring it into the present, albeit in a slightly dangerous way. I understand the risk I'm taking in asking this question, but I wonder if some of the discontents or some of the reason for which identity politics and Marxism seem to be at cross purposes at times is the possibility that what we understand to be identity politics or identity at all, whether it's politicized or not, is part of or would belong to this category of stereopathy and personalization, where identity is a kind of misplaced concreteness, a kind of misplaced or misrecognized particular in a kind of desperate, groping attempt to come to grips with real abstraction. Because, you know, I owe a lot to Marxian understandings of racial categories from Fanon on. I mean, there have been a number of recent, really brilliant interventions along those lines that recognize racial categories as themselves functions of, you know, the term racial capitalism, right, is very useful. So I wonder if it would be possible to understand, or part of the reason that identity politics keep kind of failing the possibilities that we hope for, right? We want identity politics to work out, to kind of get at some of the kind of moving totality of the problem, and yet they keep failing again and again and again. So I wonder if that's part of this constellation of stereopathy and personalization that you refer to, which is a kind of misplaced concreteness that, you know, we want identity politics to win on some level, but on the other hand, as Marxists, we can't help but notice that it can't see the forest for the trees. So is this part of what you would diagnose as, or you would diagnose via Adorno as stereopathy and personalization, or is this a different problem altogether? In other words, is this misrecognized concretion that is trying so hard to get at the sort of abstract totality, but is missing the mark by trying to identify identity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. I guess there's a couple of different ways of going about this. One, which I won't go into because it's not my own direct area of research or concern, is actually looking at the way in which Adorno's thinking in particular was formed in this dialogue with the emergent concept of identity, like, right, as a concept in social thought, right? And there's a very extremely interesting, I think, and incisive book by Eric Oberle, the Century of Negative Identity, I think it's called. I forget the exact title, but it's about Adorno. And it's about his, the way he's also responding, or him and the Frankfurt School are responding, including in the writings on anti-Semitism, to figures like Erikson, who comes up with the very notion of identity, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a whole, like, very complicated relationship that debate has with the long and strange history of how identity then kind of congeals, right, into a concept within a kind of US social scientific and then political domain. And that's a kind of fascinating history in its own right, in which, at least according to Oberle, both Adorno and the Frankfurt School play quite a formative role, albeit not obviously in the cultural Marxist sense, right? Like Adorno came up with identity theory, or the politics of identity. That's a bit like that. I was just reading, it was in the Andreas Malm and Zekin Collective Fossil Fascism book, where they quote this brilliant bit from Bolsonaro's chief ideologue, who repeatedly tried to persuade people that Adorno had written all the lyrics to the Beatles, which, therefore is a sign of their intense power, which is a very perverse story in any case. I think one angle for it, that might be fruitful, is to see the way in which Adorno, as part of that debate, right, of ticket thinking, personalization, stereotypy, tries to think of how typology is reified into social relations, right? And of course, that's an inevitable question if one is trying to also theorize anti-Semitism or racism more broadly. And what I was very struck in the formulation of stereotypy, which is at the source of this weird figure that he doesn't really develop much, but which I actually think is very promising for thinking contemporary subjectivity. I think we're all, in some sense or another, stereopaths, right? Not sociopaths, but stereopaths. Is this idea of the tool and the scar, right? Which I think is very striking, right? Like, so the idea that the stereotype is also based on a form of, a kind of like form of psychic wound that is then shaped into a cognitive form of orientation, a limiting or limited form of orientation, but one that feels vital nevertheless, right? So I think it's at that level, and that level is interesting methodologically for the authoritarian personality, because Adorno's problem is, in a sense, and partly it's his self-justification of being part of this project, right? Which is like, on one level, the whole project is contrary to his own social thought. You could even say to his ethics, right? Like the idea that you could quantify and measure and categorize the thoughts and behaviors of entire populations through questionnaire, but his own way of self-justifying is through this, in many ways kind of messed up, pessimistic anthropological philosophy of history, right? It's like, well, this works because the catastrophe of our current society is that we are that we do behave like types, right? Like the authoritarian personality is rigid. These people do exist in groups, and people do have stereotypes, and And that's why he has this very odd moment where he says, the reason why social psychology, the reason why we can study fascism through psychology is because psychology is dead, in the sense that, like, psychology in the positive sense of complex, subjective spiritual comportments, right? And I think, so I think that, in some sense, that problematic, I think, is one that is interesting to think about. Now, of course, the part of the problem, part of the large problem of dealing with these issues is it's often very unclear, right? Like, we all know, but we all don't really know what we mean by identity politics or the politics of identity. And likewise, the more severe problem, I think, is the inability, and that's why I think the debate about abstraction is so interesting, right? Like the inability of a lot of putatively Marxist critique to be able to traverse its own identity fantasies, which are severe, right? Like the fantasies which allow people who try to argue about, Brexit as a working class revolt to read like marketing data about, C2D groups and fantasize that there's some kind of insurgent proletariat or some such nonsense, right? So like and I found that moment really fascinating, right? Where, not to put too fine a point on it, like Marxist political theorists and political economists, etc., started thinking they were doing class analysis using the same, using just these graphs and statistics that involve no class analysis whatsoever, because they're just about like income or have you gone to university or whatever, right? Which is not class analysis. But so that was also like there's also the misplaced concreteness in the class analysis itself, right? Which is, I think in some sense, I guess I very much take on the suggestion you make. It just, but the critique has to be like a total one, right? It can't then rely on smuggling in a sense that there is, right? Like an identity from which that critique is made, or a position that would be closer to the abstraction because it's class. So I think that's also the other vital aspect, both of the argument about racial capitalism and also about arguments such as the ones you find in some of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's arguments and elsewhere about the link between racism and abstraction itself, right? That it then allows you not to think that that somehow, just by virtue of talking about class, you're somehow closer, right, to the real determining dynamics, right, to the real structural dynamics, and that somehow those are primary vis-a-vis, any other determinations. But I do think the stereopathy is really is kind of really useful, because not to engage, not to assume too much the fact that I'm now in a communication department, but there is something about the fact that these category or these forms of typification are, they're written into, like they're coded into the very means of subjective expression and largely subjective formation, right? And so in some sense, like the super pessimistic Adorno thesis is like even more extreme, because it's not just like, okay, well, types are social facts, right? Like, so the bigoted country club racist is a thing, right? And they're all the same, actually, right? We just have to cope with that. But it's the fact that then those types are now themselves, right? Like objects of, like the type is itself an object of commodification, right? Technological commodification, sale, production, and so on and so forth, which makes, writing something like the authoritarian personality in a contemporary vein very weird, right? Like, because the objectification of the psychological categories is like one of the largest, one of the largest objectives of capital and capitalists in our age, right? Like, that's where a lot of the money is made. And so that also makes it very contorted, I think, as a problem. But I do think at the subjective level, there is something about realizing that one is a stereopath, right? The
Yeah.
one is determined and overdetermined in that way. And I suppose, you know, it's not incidental to Adorno's insights into this that the Princeton research project was where, you know, Lazarsfeld made this machine to do the the liking was like a technological solution to radio listener studies that they were paid to do, you know, that Adorno got his job doing, right? It was consumer research. Consumer research that, so I think there is something interesting about the insights that he had, including into then form, you know, certain fascist potentials, also had to do with participating in communicative research activity of making types, right? And in that sense, if you think of the type identity relationship, right? So I think that's why I think the category of the type and typology as a form of abstraction is an interesting vector, right, through which to get into these debates, because it might also displace the things that we think we know, right, about identity or what that might mean.
Thank you. That's a very sensitive and self-reflexive response. I'm really grateful for it. Thanks very much.
Okay, we have
some questions. There's Dave and
yeah, we've got a number of questions. We're going to start with Ahmed, who's been waiting quite a while. Then we'll go on to Dave and Alan, and then third. So Ahmed. Unmute, Ahmed.
I'm sorry, yes. Hi, I have a question related to the part of Alberto's talk about the correspondence between Adorno and Sohn-Rethel. I think it's an important place to, I would say, start any discussion about the relation between whatever we call it, an organic form, a totality, capitalism, however, a structure that has sort of become independent from its own presuppositions. But anyway, the central concept seems to be real abstraction, and the way Alberto laid out, how to even put it, the modality of a system, the working, the inner workings of a system in which a lot of operations are performed. I don't know if abstraction is the engine, or it's one of its arms, or it's just its nature, or its most immediate effect. It's a semblance, it's an illusion, or it's real. It's called real. But the point where sort of caught my eyes in a sense was where Sohn-Rethel all the time from 1936, the first letter to Adorno, all the way to, I mean, he survived Adorno. He was really obsessed with this notion of looking at categories of thought and then perhaps categories of social formation in an independence from its, there's only one concept for it, it's genesis. And all along, Adorno was trying to tell him that the genesis of this structure is not just done for. We cannot even understand the working of this structure, this organic form, as Marx called it in Grundrisse, without looking at the ways the genesis all the time intervenes and creates what he says antinomies. And these antinomies, or one antinomy of genesis and validity, he took it from Neo-Kantians. And this tension, I mean, he really used the word antinomy in a strict sense, not just some paradox or some contradiction that we can forget in our next step or book. This antinomy wants us to see both, on the one hand, that this is an independent structure doing its own work, and at the same time, it has something from its genesis. We can call it the history of capitalism. There is no little trace of that in Kapital. You can call it species thinking. You can go 1,000 years back to the very first manifestations of exchange, as you mentioned, rightly that is a force that is still, for Adorno was the main thing, the name of the evil in a sense, but at the same time the name of the good, because he did not do away with exchange. Exchange for him was a force that could sort of help the subject rise above the mere naturalness. You can call it a residual Hegelianism, but exchange wasn't just, and with it, the abstraction wasn't just a bad force, a subjugating force. So this antinomy between how something came about and what promises it brings with it, and all the pathologies that we saw in your talk, and I'm sure in tomorrow and the next day we'll see more of it, all the way to the concept of reification. Seems to be the dirtiest word, the worst concept that everyone is recoil at it for quite good reasons. But at the same time, reification for Adorno was also a positive force, because it says it's not just about subjectivity, it's not just about you, it's not just about the idealist notion of devouring everything into the subject. It's good that certain things are objectified beyond your reach, and that is part of the genesis of this whole structure that you have skillfully laid out. What do you think about this antinomy, Alberto? That is, I think, very, very much on display in the correspondence earlier in the book. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that. In terms of, I guess that was slightly what I was very, very quickly, probably because I've also not really made up my mind about it, but trying to at least just gesture towards in this discussion that they have in these letters in 38 after Sohn-Rethel reads the manuscript, I guess the first version of the Husserl book, right? And he's praising Sohn-Rethel and yet saying, no, I don't think we should use it. Immanent critique, right? Like you cannot, which I think is a really a kind of fascinating debate, right? Like Sohn-Rethel says, no, actually you need this static formal genesis in order to even understand what then will later develop, right? You can't just in a kind of Hegelian manner enter within the inner dynamic and contradictoriness of these thoughts, because you really have to accept the fact that they're that philosophy does not know what it does, right? In some sense, and that there is some other, in some sense, for Sohn-Rethel, that weird translation of Marxist analysis of the commodity form onto this radically pre-capitalist situation, right? Of the Greek agora and the emergence of philosophy, etc., is a way of finding the form of the thought outside of thought, right? And finding the form of the thought outside of thought means that the critique can't really be immanent, right? But I also found it interesting that debate, I think, is also that there is something about the fact that while returning to what he calls this bourgeois principle of exchange, Adorno finds himself, if not prioritizing or at least emphasizing, the moment of labor. This is both in his Kant lectures and in his writings on Hegel, right? Like the idea that basically spirit is social labor and conscious of itself, or the and so the link, there is a real opposition, right, between the transcendental subject as money, in some sense, as Sohn-Rethel puts it in one of those letters, and Adorno's focus on labor. And it's almost as if the possibility of the immanent critique also requires, for Adorno, this primacy of the moment of labor, not just of abstract labor, I think, but also of labor understood in this kind of subjective manner. That's one aspect, and then the other aspect, of course, is the sense that is Adorno's insistence, which I think comes across very much also in those famous letters with Benjamin, right, about the Arcades project, where Adorno sort of chides Benjamin for what he sees as this kind of impressionistic, right, form of linking the forms of capital to the forms of culture, putting it really crudely here, instead of engaging in a totalization that traverses the detail into then grasping the particular figure or mode of capitalism, you know, in the Paris of the Second Empire in this case, or elsewhere. And it's true that it's extremely striking, I think, by contrast with Adorno. Think also, for instance, of the figurations of capital in Adorno's writings of music, right? It's very striking how, on one level, extremely sketchy, right? Sketchy, generic, the place of the historical detail is in Sohn-Rethel, right? In intellectual and manual labor, right? It's you have, you know, between between the 7th, 6th, 5th century BC and then you know, Dürer, not much happens for the sake of the development of abstract, you know, of the genesis of abstract thought forms, right? Because it's kind of like philosophy, and then it's really the technological product, you know, or yeah, technology and production as then thought of through Dürer and Taylorism and so on and so forth. So I think that's there's such a immense difference in kind of sensibility, and in some sense, you know, you could. I think Sohn-Rethel and Sohn-Rethel's thesis is essential for broadly speaking dialectical thought or criticism, but I wouldn't entirely say that he's the dialectical thinker, right? I think here the point that many critics have made, that there's still an extremely strong presence, for instance, of Zimmel's philosophy of money and of a certain, you know, I mean, this is also true of various figures in the Frankfurt School, like, right, the place of those turn of the century debates is very strong, I think. The other thing that I wanted to say, I mean, it's a very rich question and I can't do it justice, but the other thing I wanted to say is that I think it's really striking, and again, it's not something I've looked into sufficiently, but it's very striking what happens in that moment, especially in the writings on anti-Semitism and in 1941, partly overdetermined by this American exile, I'm sure, but this link between the market and, you know, the market and individualism, right? And that weird passage, which of course, you know, to go back to Jale's question, right? Like any attention to actually existing racial capitalism would blow out of the water, right? Like this idea that, oh yeah, you know, liberalism has immense violence, but its violence is like abstract in the sense of it doesn't, you know, pay any attention to difference. It's like this ridiculous, like historically ridiculous claim, right? And actually, that's one of the curious aspects of this moment, right? Because in some sense, actually, I think those projects or even the elements of anti-Semitism chapter in Dialectic of Enlightenment are like methodologically brilliant ways of thinking about racial capitalism, but they're unable to think about race. So it's kind of weird, like, or they're only able to think about the singular relationship of Jews and imaginaries of Jews and social relations involving Jews vis-a-vis capitalism, but everything else is kind of blocked out. But actually, as a method, I think, you know, they do something which is really bold and risky in that essay, which is to say, oh no, these are not just fantasies. They actually have to do with real social processes, right? Like they actually have to do with the fact that like real Jews were real intermediaries in real capitalism, right? It's not just like some thing that just came out of nowhere, right? And whilst making clear like the intense ideological refractions and perversions and distortions, but they do try to try to base it in like a materialist historical analysis, right, of how people are differentiated, how capital how capital needs this differentiation, right, and how the creation, like the racial creation of the intermediary. I mean, it's like it's a massively significant process, but they somehow can't apply this method to anything else. So when Adorno or rest of the Frankfurt School, I mean, it's kind of like bewildering how like superficial any understanding of the history of race and slavery and everything else in the United States, or immigration or anything. You know, it's like very, very odd that even in the authoritarian personality, it's like, you know, blacks are object of prejudice and so on, but there isn't like, and even the severity of that is recognized, but there's no way of theorizing it, right? And that's uncanny because it's like, well, you have all the tools. like there's no reason other than like, I guess your own kind of particular, but I again, to go back to that point that I wanted to make is that I think it's really interesting in terms of the question of, you know, real abstraction, political economy, and fascism, that Adorno, and to some extent, and in a very different vein, Sohn-Rethel, are unable to think about the ways in which capitalism persists under National Socialism, right? Like, so they have this kind of, I think, rather fantastical notion that it's like the death of the market, the death of price, and therefore, in a sense, the death of the individual, right? So there is something quite crude about that, to which I think instead the analysis that you find in Neumann and Marcuse at the same time, right, which actually see the Nazi state as a very weird entity where people are, where it's just like a welter of economic struggles and factional struggles and inter-struggles. Is not at all coherent. It's extremely internally competitive and so on and so forth. Is a much, and that's why Marcuse then says, oh, actually, this is like hyper competition, right? It's not like some fully centralized planned economy, or it's not like in Sohn-Rethel, like the euthanasia of the consumer, right? That's like the vision that Sohn-Rethel kind of somewhat bizarrely has. So in any case, I think that's where you see also these important philosophical differences also playing out, right, at the level of conjunctural analysis, which I guess is what interests me about this moment. Even though it's intriguing that they don't, in the correspondence, Adorno and Sohn-Rethel don't really discuss, right, like the theory of fascism. They discuss, they give each other news about what's happening. And of course, Adorno also appreciates the fact that Sohn-Rethel, having had this weird, like, undercover insider working for, you know, German business concerns before leaving, has a lot of information, right? Like, has a lot of knowledge about who's who. And in fact, apparently, when he went to England, he would write reports for the people around Churchill that were trying to work against appeasement, right? So there's also like all of this this kind of practical element.
Okay, we have 4 questions, and I'd like to get them all before we finish.
Okay.
Can I ask questioners to keep relatively brief? And our next one is Dave Beach.
Hi, yeah, it's very brief actually. It's all in the.
How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Long time no
Nice
see.
to see you. Yeah, is in my understanding, it's like 2008 when you wrote The Open Secret of Real Abstraction, so it's quite a long time ago. And I was wondering whether you have any sense of your position on real abstraction changing. Have you, gone through a kind of volte-face at any point and you thought, I want to revisit this because something's changed, or the context has changed? I did go to the toilet at one point, so I might have missed it, but I don't think you mentioned cognitive capitalism today.
I did not.
So there's
yeah.
so the context for you thinking about it seems to have changed, and I wonder whether is this pushing it in further, or is this actually a change of direction? That's it.
Well, thanks for thanks for giving me that weird opportunity of like reflecting about something I haven't thought about quite in that form before. It's true, I guess, that, I mean, I suppose the first aspect of it has to do with the fact that my curiosity, my original curiosity about Sohn-Rethel very much came out of Italian, quote unquote, post-Porcherist debates, which is where I first encountered him, right? Which I think as I first encountered him, actually reading Paolo Villano, if I'm not mistaken, long, like 20 years ago or something. And of course, as now appears in Richard Broady's translation, actually in the HM edition of Intellectual Manual Labor, it has this postface, right, which is all these texts that appeared, short texts, but in the extremely influential and consequential far left journal of the group Lotta Continua, right? So you have these texts by Costanzo Podeve, Pieraldo Dovati, and Negri himself. This is also a funny story because the texts are Lotta Continua because Dovati and Negri wrote prefaces to Sohn-Rethel's book that was published by Feltrinelli. And he was just like, I'm having none of this. Like, you put these prefaces in, I'm pulling my book, right? Because they were like in that form that you found, especially in the 70s, and I think continues, which is like the critical preface, right? Like nobody wants the preface or like that before you've even started to read the book says, you know, and the following 4 shortcomings, devastating shortcomings, you know, etc. So they go into, but he was very much part of that debate. And in fact, I mean, I thought I'd mention this because it's one of these really weird anecdotes. There's a recent issue of a journal whose name I can't remember. It's like a French journal about German thought, where a French philosopher, I think, called Charles Alunni, tells this anecdote where he was at this conference in Calabria in 1977, on Sohn-Rethel's work, with Sohn-Rethel, in which he later found out was the place where the Red Brigades met in the corridor to decide the Aldo Moro kidnapping. So it's a very Italian story, which was quite a... I still need to corroborate this, but I was like, oh, really? Okay. Nothing like that has happened in the corridors of the HM conference in London, but in any case. So it comes out of that. And then, yeah, I was kind of trying partly to respond to what were some of my misgivings, I guess, about those debates about immateriality and cognitive capitalism. And so I guess the presence of Sohn-Rethel in those debates was a kind of hook for semi-immanent critique, as it were, quasi-immanent critique. And I guess the other element was, which I think comes out more clearly in this kind of some rather overlapping piece that I wrote at the same time for Theory, Culture, and Society, self-cannibalizing half of the other article in a very improper way, called The Culture of Abstraction, which is kind of like more like using these debates as a polemic against, you know, I guess what then would become like new materialisms, et cetera, right? And so as a way of just saying, okay, well, at least this, and especially, you know, and I guess the other place where I encountered it was Zizek's Sublime Object of Ideology, right? So I guess like the piece kind of came out of this, oh, you know, here's like Zizek trying to think through Freud and Marx and criticizing Althusser and indeed the Frankfurt School as well by turning to Sohn-Rethel. And then these kind of Italian sort of debates, and then the moment. So I guess that's the triangle, right, of sorts. And I suppose, but all of that and that piece, it's like very derivative. I mean, it's, you know, I'm just like trying to put together some literatures I come across that I think had interesting connections, right? And I guess when I've gone back to that recently has been to try to puzzle out, like, okay, well, this is a really, you know, I think really like a very important insight or whatever you want to call it, or starting point. But, you know, what can one do with it for thinking other phenomena or other debates that, you know, because I guess I also recognize, right, like the Sohn-Rethel's own limitation of what he's talking about to this critique of epistemology, right? And he's quite clear about that, and I think so already to move it beyond that is a transcoding, you know, it's a kind of projection. But I am very interested, I guess and that's partly what this comes out of, is just thinking through other things that I'm trying to puzzle out on or work on, like debates about racial capitalism, like contemporary debates about fascism. Is like, does this have any place in it? And I guess the talk I gave was an effort to think like, these, how is it that in the 30s, these concepts of real abstraction are being developed, right? Not necessarily as like key components of theories of fascism, because they're not, I don't think, but sort of alongside them. And actually the Lefebvre and Guterman, which was a belated discovery like of a few months ago, is interesting, because their point is quite different. It's like, oh no, actually we need to really think, right, through this problem of abstraction at these multiple levels, right? And that's where they have, and that's what I got very, and again, it's not that I've done much work on it, but the way in which they treat abstraction, both to address in the 30s the question of finance capital, and to think of this like incoherent welter of uneven ideological elements that are then kind of recombined by fascism. So there's a lot of like affinity, as I was trying to say, like with Bloch as well, right? And I think then it turns out to be to my mind, like a much richer set of debates. But then its relevance, its relation to the more technical aspects of Sohn-Rethel is quite limited, you could say. I mean, though the affinities are interesting, because its problem is not the problem of it's not the problem of intellectual labor, it's not the problem of philosophy, right? It's not the problem of epistemology. It's a much more kind of conjunctural problem. And though very interesting in terms of his actual analyses of fascism, at the level of his theory, Sohn-Rethel is not a conjunctural thinker. And so I guess that's what, thanks for allowing me to clarify this, if I have to myself to some extent. But I think it's a question of how do these questions of real abstraction relate, let's say, to forms of more conjunctural analysis that I'm interested in, I suppose. And I guess that's where the way this plays out in different moments of Adorno's analysis of both actual fascism and potential fascism. Like, why does he keep turning to, like, what does he kind of reference Sohn-Rethel in these kind of oblique ways, right? Real abstractness here, or talking about the exchange principle when he's trying to think about German war guilt. Like, he seems to mobilize it, right? Not necessarily as like a theoretical totality of some sort, but as a very key moment. Like, there's certain key moments in arguments where somehow the fact that the abstraction is not in the mind is very significant for Adorno, and I think is very significant in general. I guess that's what, like, I'm still trying to kind of puzzle out. I think it's a different question, which I'm increasingly thinking is like a very separate question, is the question which the intervention before is pointing out, which is really like how this addresses how one does like the history of philosophy from a broadly historical materialist or Marxist perspective, right? Like, and that's, I think, a kind of different question. We can relate it, but different. Like, in what sense does thinking of the genesis of different philosophical moments or philosophical forms in either commodity exchange or various forms of capitalism in different ways, is like that. I think that's a different problem than thinking the more conjunctural, like abstraction is a more conjunctural kind of question, I guess. And I guess it's, yeah, and I'm not that interested now, just personally, in the more polemical like use of it vis-a-vis current theoretical trends. Though I'm totally happy for people to do that, like, whatever debates about new materialisms, et cetera, I still think like one can do that work. It's just not like what I'm interested in this given moment. But that was actually partly the original reason why I was, I guess. So it's true that it's not like a volte-face, but it's like somewhat of a changing of the subject. If that makes sense.
Okay, Alan.
Brilliant.
Alan Smart.
Okay, I'll be fast. And I'll confess to being a little bit out of my depth here, so I'll ask a kind of a basic question that maybe can get elaborated. I'm more familiar with the Lefebvre of the 60s and 70s, who's kind of the teacher of, or somebody who informs a lot of these kind of new left discourses, but particularly the SI, and the way that they either they like critically or not, or happily or not, are interested in the way that these other kind of cultural identities or categories either replace or obscure or class as being like the important kind of appreciating category. And so in relation to this question of consumption and consumers, how does that relate to these categories being seen as almost like a consumer classes rather than productive classes, which is like a shift in that the 60s moment, where you get these ideas like social movements as opposed to political movements. And then to kind of bracket that question with the, with as a kind of a 30s moment, and then our contemporary resurgence, both of a kind of fascism, and then also these kind of new leftist movements which want to also claim a kind of populism, but then this like, and these conceptions of class based on income and even like lifestyle and stuff. And so then I was wondering how these kind of earlier thinkings about fascism would relate with, on the left, like the Stalinist moment when they're which also has this kind of bad reification in it, and a certain kind of realism as a the hallmark, and is this I don't know, is there some kind of back and forth here? I guess is the
yeah. Oh, it's a tricky, very interesting but kind of tricky question. I mean,
a confused question, but
yeah,
honestly,
but I think I have been thinking. I mean, partly because obviously of Lefebvre's very long trajectory. It's interesting. I guess I mean, one way of approaching it would be to think, well, what's the place of the consumer in theories of fascism, right? Like that, we could put it that way, which I think is an interesting question, because on one level, like I tried to put it somewhat flippantly, a certain variant of the theorizing of fascism that comes from the ambit of the Institute for Social Research, at least that line that goes through Friedrich Pollock and Horkheimer, to some extent Adorno, though I think it's much more, a bit more mixed. And then Sohn-Rethel has his own version, right? Like, as I said, this kind of weird euthanasia of the consumer, right? There's no longer a consumer when you're like forced to listen to the Nazi radio, and it is this objectified. And it's curious to me, because there is this, if not an antinomy, then like a kind of at least a tension. One second. Which is that for the likes of Adorno, you get a lot of insights into fascism from studying phenomena like the musical, the fetishism that pertains to music or commodity listening, right? Like, so that it's clear, at least following Adorno's analysis, whether explicitly or implicitly, that the fascist subject is a subject of or from or in the commodity, right? Like, there's no, that somehow fascism could not emerge without a forms of subjective formation or typification, like we're discussing with Jala, that are like deeply articulated, right? Like with the commodity form. And in many ways, including some of these, like, if you think of this essay where Adorno extremely provocatively is writing about the contradictions of Nazism's objections to jazz, right? Like almost arguing that that there is a kind of weird disavowed affinity, right? So that's very striking, because because in some way, and this obviously also has to do with the American exile, but then at the same time, Adorno is already writing this stuff before he's even stepped foot in Newark, New Jersey, in this retired beer factory, brewery, where they were doing their like-dislike studies. Yeah, so I do think that's really interesting, because, and also because, though I think Lefebvre in the 1930s, writing with Guterman, this is a moment of the surge of French fascism, the Popular Front, all the problems of the Popular Front that Lefebvre has, so it's not a moment where like the commodity or consumption is necessarily like in the same sense as Adorno, so front and center. But I do think it's a kind of interesting lineage, and it's striking to me that, at least at a theoretical level, there's a real difficulty in synthesizing these seemingly, or at least theoretically, seemingly incompatible insights about Nazism, or about fascism more broadly. So one being the role of the authoritarian state, of planning, and of the politics of command, the politicization of the economy on the one hand, and then this whole analysis of the capitalist production of subjectivity, or of the introjection of the commodity form at the level of the consumer, right? Like, which is interesting, of course, also given the role that then analyses of everyday life, right, under fascism and Nazism play later, right? You know, it's difficult to read these things about like the euthanasia, the consumer, etc., whilst also knowing like the massive production of cheesy kitsch musicals under, you know, National Socialism, like well into the war, you know, like, you know, the fact that, you know, you can't, this sort of univocal image of the totalitarian Moloch just doesn't speak to the unevenness, right? Like the fashion, you know, and I think one of the insights that's very hard won. And that's why I think Neumann's perspective in Behemoth is more, and Marcuse's is also in some way more interesting, is that they have an ear or a sense of the weird pluralism, shall we say, you know, the weird kind of weaponizing coherence through which fascism rules, right? Or the fact that, you know, as Neumann puts it, it's not even a state, right? Like it's this kind of meta-stable struggle between factions, all of whom are mediated by Hitler, and like the, you know, capitalist factions are operating like in this kind of raw, like internal war that is then covered, right, by seeming ideological cement. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I really do think that the problem of fascism does pose, right, like that relationship of production and consumption, you know, in ways that, yeah, and in ways that I guess you could see us having a long and sometimes subterranean wake, right, in those new left debates. It's of course also not insignificant, you know, that then the late 60s is of course when debates also about, depending on where you are, but usually it's like the period when debates about new fascisms arise as well, right? And in, you know, in the case of Marcuse, then he's writing about the potentials for fascism in the US, and you know, and being very conscious, you know, like, you know, via Angela Davis also is like very conscious of the racial specificity of the novel, you know, the new potentials for fascisms in the US. But then those are also like,
well, also like Chile is not like
yeah,
that's actually new fascism, which has a new spin, but that's old,
yeah. And it's also striking, you know, towards the tail end of the Sohn-Rethel Adorno letters, it gets really, it gets very cranky, right? Because of course Sohn-Rethel is having this kind of belated Maoism, and you know, and Adorno's, you know, it's like, Alfred, if you had read a word of what I'd written properly, you would understand I have nothing but horror for the Cultural Revolution. You know, this, like, it's a very weird moment. And then they're writing to each other about Vietnam. You know, it's like, it's a very, very odd afterlife, I guess, of those debates. Yeah.
Okay,
But thanks a lot for
Alberto,
that.
I'm reluctant to cut Paul off, so we can run on a little bit. But what I'm going to suggest is, I'm going to read Ferg's question, because to use his technical term is Mike's rubbish. And then I'm going to invite Arlen and Conrad to make brief questions. And then I'll ask you, Alberto, just to sum up. So Ferg's question, building on Jala's question, I wonder if your analysis of the links between fascism and real abstraction can be developed in relation to questions of gender. And he references endnotes, invert, and the use of Posthone's theory of anti-Semitism to read transphobia. Arlen, and then Conrad, and then Alberto will sum up.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the question. Sorry, what is the question about transphobia? I just can't find. Sorry, are you reading something out that I have?
I read it. It's in the chat box.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Ah, sorry, Ferg. Okay.
Sorry, Paul. I mean, I don't have a specific question.
Then can we cut it and just leave it with Conrad, because we really are.
Of course, yes.
Conrad.
Okay.
Okay. So I just want to ask you to sort of give your opinion on something based on these very intriguing and in-depth readings of these discussions on fascism that you've been doing. You know, one of the themes I think that's run through this discussion that we've been having here is potentially, you know, the disarticulation between what's termed, you know, old and new fascism, I suppose, right? And I think it's interesting, and I you know, I'll probably seem here like I'm shamelessly, you know, trying to plug the people I work with, but I contributed to a book by Matt McManus, and he's talked about the idea of postmodern conservatism, right? Which I think is an interesting sort of notion. But one thing, and I want to ask your opinion about this, I mean, I think, you know, even if we look at the debate which occurred within, you know, Heidegger and the Nazi Party in terms of sort of trying to achieve the position of being its main ideologue and ultimately being rebuked, it seems to me that the Nazis were very attached to sort of abstractions which were characteristic of pre-capitalism or early, you know, capitalism prior to when industrialization had come to fruition to a greater degree, at least on an ideological level. Of course, as you've pointed out, economically, it's quite complex, isn't it? But I think one feature of what we might describe sort of new fascism today is that reality seems as if it's become so sort of subsumed by capital that there's no actual, you know, outside or even antecedent stage that can really be appealed to. So it seems to me that one thing that kind of happens is that, you know, they reach for the way that sort of the liberal logic of the marketplace, right, always has to contain sort of its converse, right? So we could talk about the domain of social reproduction, right, you know, and sort of the heterosexist logic, which kind of governs our society, right? And what seems to be often highlighted, you know, you look at men's rights movements and these sort of things, right, is kind of the unreality of the, you know, the liberal designation of like a self-willing individual in comparison to these elements of capital which still exist. And I think in a way it's like that almost leads to a certain kind of nihilism, right, which is a little bit different than in the past, right, because what's being foregrounded is like the impossibility of this sort of liberal logic to ever kind of consummate itself, right? And I think it would be very interesting. I don't want to get into it too much here, but it might be very interesting to discuss the reception of Heidegger in Iran as well by Ali Sharadi and the way that Heidegger is sort of used to frame this sort of Islamist movement as well, right? Maybe being a turn in the way that fascism develops. But what do you think of that analysis? I mean, do you think it's in terms of the way that inconsistency is represented? Do you think it would be fair to characterize, you know, the new fascism as being postmodern in this sense, right? As you know, in terms of media saturation and the relativization of meaning and all this.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is also where I think at this level, not necessarily at others, but I think at this level, there are interesting and important differences between Italian fascism and National Socialism, just at the kind of, let's say, just at the discursive ideological level. So it's not something I would commit to print, or it's an opinion, or rather like a hunch, right? I think there, you know, of course, the world is rife with, you know, repugnant neo-Nazis and so on and so forth. I do think at the level of like the broader habitus, gestures, orientation of contemporary far rights, there is much greater affinity with a certain moment of fascism, especially the moment right before it, you know, taking hold of state power, right? So there's some like stunning and kind of fascinating in their own way pieces written by Mussolini himself. In 1921, there's an article called Fascism and Relativism. And it explicitly says, I mean, which reads like a super proto-postmodern text, right? Especially in its bizarre appropriation of so-called hoax appropriation of scientific arguments. He basically says, you know, well, fascism is to politics what relativity theory is to physics, right? Like we are leaving behind all of these dead, stale, pointless distinctions. And it says, we will be proletarian when we want to, aristocratic when we want to, and it goes through this rant, which is kind of in itself sort of fascinating. Fascism is the only politics that is explicitly at the level of or capable of matching modern relativism as a scientific paradigm, right? and it is because of a certain type of voluntarism, right? So the voluntarism, this kind of principle of will and so on, it entirely embraces like not the transvaluation of all values, but just their relativity, right? And there being an object of play and explicit, that's also, it's the laying of the cards on the table. Like, I will tell you I'm with the workers one day, and I will tell you I'm with the bourgeoisie and the next. This is what we do, right? And it's quite striking in that sense, because if, which I think is true, there is an element which we could refer to as, postmodern problematic, as we might feel about this term. But if I'm getting like what that term covers, right? The forms, the kind of ideological volatility, the irony, et cetera, like all of this was like, entirely present in that period, right? In a sense, before then you get the need to perform statesmanship, and therefore you get like a different kind of conservatism, right? Like the Lateran pacts with the church, et cetera, and where things like the influence of futurism and all this stuff become relegated, as do the weirder forms of the fascist left, right? Like, as much like happens with the Strauss rights, and that famous kind of moment that happens with in fascisms, where first there's a claim we're neither left nor right, but then it's like, obviously you're right, and there's always a purge of those people who actually think they're national socialists, right? Or that they are like against capitalism or whatever. So yeah, no, I think there is, but I don't think it's new. Like, well, obviously it is new, like anything else is new. It's new also in its modalities and its technologies and its forms of. But I think in terms of a gesture or a kind of subjectivity, to me, when I first read that piece, it was really uncanny, because it was like, oh well, this actually is much, in a way that like instead you could say that the Hitler speech still remains in this cataclysmic way a kind of modernist object, right? Like the early Mussolini speech does not. It's not like it doesn't have, or at least maybe it's modernist in the other sense, right? In the sense of the futurist and the vorticist and so on, but it's not modern in the sense of having any kind of stability of referent, or even any kind of straightforward project, right? Like, it seems relativistic even about, at that level, even about the nation, right? Or the state, or like it's all a kind of plaything for the imposition of a will, right? A political imposition of a will. And of course, like the futurist manifestos, it's going back to the gender question, right? It's like it's all about this kind of like insane form of kind of turbo masculine performance or whatever, right? So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to like make, again, this is slightly flippant, I wouldn't want to make too many like grand taxonomical claims, right? And also because of that pliant, because of that kind of pliant, relativistic and pluralistic character, then it also means that much of this is just determined by the way these forces shape themselves or morph themselves around a kind of conjuncture, right? And that's as kind of Polanyi shows very well in that piece on the popular impact of fascism, I think is the title, from the mid-70s. That ability to have not so much relativistic discourse. I think Polanyi gets more this element of being able to simultaneously address and mobilize completely incompatible constituencies, right? And wield them together, but without totalizing, right? Like so you could say it's a hegemonic project, but it's not. It's like it's different in kind from what a left hegemony would be, which is partly why, at least in the short term, it's a lot more successful, because it can just it doesn't have to fashion this coherence, right? It can play on the different registers, and it can be, you know, micro coherent for its different for its different levels, but it doesn't need like the kind of totalizing project. It just needs to weld together these. It just needs to be good ideological cement, right? And that, yeah, that's a considerable advantage, as we know.
Okay, thanks very much, Alberto. That was excellent.